Well, Canadian police attack an Aboriginal woman and her son for engaging in their traditional practices.
Lived here for most of my life, and it's been only 7 years. And that's a long time. That's my children's lifetime. My children are so upset about this, and so am I.
On the banks of British Columbia's mighty Fraser
The violence
River,
happened outside a
the state
courtroom
claims
in Chilliwack, a
jurisdiction
city
over
in the
natural
western
resources
province
and
of British
the countryside
Columbia.
of
The
Western
woman was singing a
Canadian province.
traditional song when she came under attack by several policemen. Her 18-year-old son tried to protect her, but he too was arrested by police. Well, for more on that story, we're joined by Joshua Blakeney, PressTV's correspondent, joining us from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Joshua, please tell us more about the circumstances of this arrest in front of a courtroom.
Well, indeed, this morning at 9 a.m., a trial was supposed to commence at the Chilliwack courthouse. Now, I'm in the western Canadian province of British Columbia, a territory, which didn't exist a few hundred years ago. It had indigenous people, 31 tribes exist here, distinct nations exist here, indigenous people. And one such person was on trial today, named Kwitsel Tatel, the trial of Kwitsel Tatel. And she has been criminalized for committing the crime, so-called, of trying to catch fish to feed her children, something her people have done for many thousands of years, catch the wild sockeye salmon that course through the mighty Fraser River here in British Columbia. And so we assembled at the court today. They had brought in a professor who's an expert in the Canadian Constitution. Now, Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution purports to recognize and affirm something called Aboriginal and treaty rights. And so in the Canadian Constitution, it appears to affirm the existence of something called Aboriginal rights. And one would suppose that an Aboriginal right might be to catch salmon, as their people have done for many thousands of years. But increasingly, we find that indigenous people in Canada are being criminalized. And so Kwitsel Tatel, she decided to sing a traditional song as she entered the court this morning. And I was a witness to this, along with many of her supporters. And within seconds, she found herself being flung to the floor for merely singing a song and tapping on a small drum as she entered the court building. Not the courtroom, but merely the court building. Almost half a dozen hefty, gun-toting, tazer-possessing henchmen of the state, seized her and put her to the ground. Now, when her 18-year-old son sought to defend her, not only was Kwitsel Tatel finding herself being brutalized by the state, her 18-year-old son, as he pleaded with the police to release his mother, found himself being criminalized, arrested, and indeed manhandled, punched in the head by a police officer. And so I witnessed an extraordinary event today where we saw, a lack of cultural sensitivity. I mean, that's really an understatement by police officers inside the Chilliwack courthouse who appeared to be non-Aboriginal, non-Starlo. The indigenous people here are the Starlo people. We had the semantics was not very good. You had these kind of seemingly white police officers manhandling an Aboriginal lady who's being criminalized for the crime of catching fish. And so I witnessed an extraordinary event today.
Joshua, if you will, tell us about the overall circumstances and living conditions of Aboriginals and the rights of Natives in Canada. We know that in the United States, they've been mostly confined to reservoirs. Is it similar up north?
Reservations. Well, they have a reservation system in the United States. They have reserves in Canada. Now, the Canadian government had a very, very slightly more benevolent policy when comparison with the United States, where there was a kind of treaty system that was taken up, in Canada. So many Indian tribes have a treaty with the Canadian state. So they formally agreed to allow, certain corporations or state institutions to despoil and develop the resources in the area. In British Columbia, such treaties are ongoing now, but the Starlo people, of which Kwitsel Tatel, who was brutalized today, belongs, they have never signed a treaty with the Canadian state. And so such people would view these territories here, which are highly rich in resources, as being possessed by the indigenous people who live here. And so we see this situation where the Canadian Constitution purports to recognize and affirm Aboriginal rights. But invariably, Aboriginal people find themselves being criminalized. And then once they're being criminalized, they then get a day in court to try and prove they have something called rights. And so it appears the rights that the Canadian Constitution purports to uphold are not inherent rights. And another problem that exists in the court system here is the Aboriginal people. They invariably plead guilty because they're invariably poor, perhaps drug-addicted, victims of all kinds of abuse from the state and from other forces. And so what we see with Kwitsel Tatel, this individual who I've been witnessing today, she's actually pled not guilty in court. It's very, very rare for an Aboriginal person to plead not guilty in court because they can't afford a lawyer. And so the system's in place to criminalize Native Americans and First Nations people here in Canada. And when someone actually stands up to the system and decides to say, I'm not guilty, I have a right to, for example, catch fish or access the resources that were under the feet of my historic territories, you see that the state cracking down in such a brutal way. Indeed, there was a Professor, Anthony Hall, seeking to enter the court today. He had his evidence seized by the state, requisitioned, a box smashed, so the evidence that was supposed to be submitted in an objective manner to the court was seized by these henchmen of the state, who, as I say, were armed with guns and were brutalizing two native peoples here in Canada.
Right.
And so we see.
All right, many thanks, Joshua. Press TV's Joshua Blakeney from Calgary, Alberta, Canada.